Well, welcome to our new mini series, Strategic Thinking in Long Term Crisis. We have been meeting together in a community circle conversations setting for about I don't even know how many weeks now. I should have counted, but since mid-March. And one of the opportunities that we had was to ask what additional technical assistance or expertise did our sector feel like they needed right now? And we had the opportunity to hear from our participants who said the perennial need is fund development expertise. And then strategic planning really also rose to the top. So of course, I set off to research who we could bring in to help us to really think through strategic thinking in this time. And I came across Nico Chin and Up With Community and some of the resources that you had been providing. And as seems to happen, once you hear about something or see someone, they start popping up in other places too. So I had the opportunity to watch Nico as part of a Grant Makers for Effective Organizations panel. And I thought it would be a great opportunity, since we're in a virtual space, to invite a national consultant to work with us in our Des Moines community. And Nico let me know she's been to Des Moines before and she's from the Midwest. Although if you wanted to maybe just introduce Up With Community a little bit and tell us where you are now, and then we'll get started.
Yeah, I'm happy to do that. So hi, everyone. It is really fun to be with you. I grew up in Chicago and have family kind of all over that northern part of the Midwest. And I also do some work around animal agriculture. And so I've had a chance to come to Iowa, and I shared with Brienne, I've been to your water treatment facility in Des Moines. I founded Up With Community about 8 years ago, after having worked in almost all the jobs that I could in a nonprofit, being an executive director, communications, HR, fundraising. And I really got to this point where I said, I've worked with incredibly wonderful people that I feel blessed to be connected to, and yet we still aren't making the change in the world that I think we're capable of. And that really brought me to learning everything I could about adult learning, and how to really integrate learning in strategic thinking, organizational development and organization building, and equity. So that's what I founded Up With Community to do. We are a practice that helps teams connect to their personal power for change and orient them towards creativity, impact, and freedom. And it was through this work that we came to strategic thinking in crises. And I'll pause here, Brienne, because I wasn't sure if you wanted to do some of the polls before I dive in.
Yes, perfect. Well, let's try and activate the questions, which did not get added. So let's try and see if we can do it in real time. Oh my goodness. Are you guys all still hearing me? Are we in there? Okay.
I can hear you.
Thanks. Well, I had a poll that I thought was ready to go, but we will do it right now. Nico, if you just want to give me a minute and maybe tee up your next piece, and then I'll get that poll activated.
Let's do that. So, Bridget, if we want to move to the next slide, happy to do it, Brienne. I've been there before. I think all of us have. So today we're going to talk about exploring strategic thinking in crises. And this is going to be the foundation for the next 2 sessions that we talk about. Our purpose here is to really help your organization navigate crises by engaging your staff and your board in this framework that can help you pivot in real time. And the idea is we don't know what next week holds. Tornado warning example. And so how can we show up in the work personally and as a team that allows us to step back from being perfect into being ready, that allows us to step back from control and into justice? And I'll talk more about that in just a minute. So we really have 3 learning objectives for the series. We want to first invite you to reflect on what are your standard ways of operating? Because a lot of times those standard ways of operating were created to function really well, not in a crisis. For some of you, that's not the case. Some of you may work in crisis communities and crisis areas, and you may already have those tactics. But for a lot of us, we've built organizations that can weather a crisis, can weather a short-term crisis, but we aren't built to necessarily move through the world changing over a 2-year process, right? As you do that understanding of your standard way of operating, where are the gaps and opportunities in this time of crisis and period of crises? And throughout all of this work on strategy, how can we foreground equity? So that's what we'll be looking into. Brianne.
Great. I've got the poll ready again. So
Awesome.
we'll be asking, what is your position in your organization? And then I just want to get a sense of if these organizations have a strategic plan. So I'm going to launch that. So go ahead and take a minute or 10 seconds, hopefully, to let me know who you are and sort of where you are in the strategic planning world. Looking right now like, oh, I love to see it shift. I don't know. Can you guys see on your side, like where people are? Oh, it's all a mystery. So we've got about 75% of people who voted so far. If you don't really know if you have a strategic plan or not, that's okay. You can maybe say no or assume it's on a shelf somewhere. I don't know. Great. And we have about 10 people who haven't voted, but let's go ahead and close the poll. And you can see the majority of folks on our call are executive directors. We have a few board members. So kudos to the board members who see their role in strategy. We have some leadership team members, support staff, and a few consultants on the line too. About 63% of you have a strategic plan and use it. So great. That's a wonderful start. And sometimes that can even be more confusing during these times of, how do you pivot, as we said, and use your, keep your strategic plan perhaps as a guidepost, but revisit it. 21% said it's on a shelf somewhere. So an opportunity maybe to dust that off and reimagine it. And then about 15% of you said you don't. So I am just going to share those real quick and give you a moment to absorb where you fit in this spectrum. And then Nico, if you want to take it away again, thank you so much for helping me stall while I rebuilt that.
It's all good, Brianne. It's all good. So here we are. I want to share with you, as we think about strategic thinking and foregrounding and centering equity, racial equity, gender equity. I believe all of these equities have a shared root. I want to make sure that we understand that equity isn't like the side thing to the strategic planning. It is in the center of all that we do. And one of the ways that we hold that through line is by using a set of community commitments that help guide the work that we do. And I want to share these community commitments with you today. We don't have a chance to question them and get you to opt into using them. This is largely a presentation from me, but I want you to understand the community commitments that I use when I'm working with groups, and it was really the foundation for the framework you're about to see. So Bridget, we can advance one more slide. Community brave space, and I'm sorry it's cut off. This is actually not my set of commitments. It shows up when we're not in this kind of format of showing on Zoom. And in a future slideshow, you'll be able to see it more properly. But this was created by Equity Matters, a multiracial facilitation team that had been facilitating meetings for now it must be over 20 years when they created this set of agreements that are really here to help us be able to think about what we are seeing in the world, what we are experiencing in ourselves, and the power dynamics in that whole system. And one of the core tenets of being able to do strategic thinking in a crisis is being able to talk about power. So just take a moment to read these.
I do think we have a few folks who are calling in, so I will make sure to voice them as well. And I know
Oh,
that we want to be accessible to everybody.
oh,
So,
sorry. And Brianne, I can go ahead and do that.
okay,
Don't worry. And if
sure.
you want to email, if you know who those people are, you can email them the slides,
Yeah,
whichever you want. But I'll
we
name
will be
these for right
sending a
now.
recap out for sure.
Great, great.
And
So,
I will add in also, so Color Brave Space. Can you say one more time? I did search it to see Equity Matters. Is that the
yes,
organization? Okay.
yes.
So I will actually go ahead and put their link in the chat box as
Oh, thanks a
well.
lot. Thank you.
Absolutely.
So these include put relationship first, keep focused on our common goal, notice power dynamics in the room, create space for multiple truths and norms, be kind and brave, lean into discomfort, practice examining racially biased systems and processes, and look for learning. We're going to have time for questions and answers at the end of this time. So if you have questions about what any of these mean, jot those down, keep them handy. We will come back to them. All right. So Bridget, let's go to the next slide really quickly. So this is the framework that we're going to be using. I know that Brianne had asked everyone to print it out if possible. If we want right now, Bridget, I think we can put this link into the chat. If anybody doesn't have it printed out. Beautiful.
I did just pop that in the chat for
Fabulous. And if
everybody.
you
So.
want to take off the slides, people might just, you don't have to look at the slides anymore. You can look at wherever you're looking at this document on your screen or whatever you'd like. And if you go into speaker view, you get to see my face really big.
I will actually probably go ahead and share the slides. I'll pull that up on
Okay,
my
great,
screen and so that people can see that.
great.
But
So beautiful.
let me
So a
find
little
it.
bit on page 1, and if you're following along with me, I'll just be shouting out the page numbers as we go through. So on page 1, I'll share a little bit of how we built this framework. So when I first started wanting to do racial equity work with organizations, what I ran into very quickly was if an organization wasn't a learning organization, if they didn't have time to take in information, process it, and then act on it in a reflective way as individuals in a team, they weren't going to be set up to do racial equity. So very early on, I started teaching both adult learning and racial equity together, right? When racial equity was treated as a topic of content without a system of practices, people would go to really good content-filled trainings and then not know what to do with it, right? So that led us to thinking about adult learning. That led us to thinking about strategic thinking, right? And so it was lovely to see that 63% of people have a plan that you're using. Using your plan means you're doing some form of strategic thinking as you're together. And two of the people that I love for strategic thinking are linked to on this page. STP, the Social Transformation Project, and Eric Peterson. These are two people who have been doing a lot of thinking about how to think strategically. And so I've been working with their frameworks for 6 or 7 years before COVID-19. Come to COVID-19, and the third week, I got on the phone. I was still kind of deer in headlights, but maybe I had started coming into my body. You know, my husband called me up at 4 o'clock on a Thursday and said, we're taking our 2-year-old and our 4-year-old out of daycare, and I don't know when they're going back. And I said, great, I'll go shop for 2 weeks worth of groceries. And just as those groceries were running out, I got on a call with a partner that I had been doing racial equity work with. And that partner was preparing for a board meeting. And that partner said, you know, I need to talk to them about the last 2 weeks. They were a partner who had a very strong strategic plan, very in-depth strategic thinking, consistently had their plan be a living plan. And I said, great, why don't you tell me, you know, off the top of your head, this was the executive director and the board chair. Why don't you tell me off the top of your head what you want to tell the board? And it was with all compassion, a kind of mash of tactics and strategies and values and mission and fundraising, not kind of organized in a way that people could enter into and kind of see the whole, while also being able to zoom into the gaps or opportunities that they needed to. And so on that call in real time, I used these two frameworks on page 1 to develop these altitudes that you see in the framework, as a way to say that there may be different altitudes that you need to fly at, right? And one of the most important pieces of putting together this framework was really to say to that partner and to all the partners that I work with, that one of the greatest ways we can reenact iniquity is to treat this crisis as if it's just another one of the projects that you do. Because we will work from assumptions, implicit biases, and inaccurate information in the course of trying to make decisions in our work. And so needing to step back and see all of these different altitudes is both wanting to make the implicit explicit, make our assumptions clear so that we can make stronger decisions together, but it's also meant to bring social and emotional learning into the hard work of fundraising, crisis communications, program development, program evaluation. For some of you, that may be the world you live in. For others, that may not, right? And so some of our, I forgot to say that my 2-year-old and my 4-year-old are still here. And my 2-year-old just found me, even though I was hiding a little bit. So we're just gonna welcome Rajan, and he may make a little appearance, but we're just gonna keep going. And if his daddy doesn't find him in a few minutes, then I'll have to just take a minute to bring him back. All right. So one of the important things that we want to bring to this framework is not just, are you thinking about your vision? Are you getting good information? Are you making the right choices on justice? But it's really, are you caring for your body through this process? Are you processing stress and anxiety through this process? Are you confronting feelings of fear and allowing people to move through those feelings that they need to move through? Okay. We're just gonna let this ride until it gets to be disruptive.
That's okay. We have been honoring the vulnerability in our community circles of everybody who is coming and leading with different circumstances. So thank you for just acknowledging that. And yeah, so do we want to kind of talk in a little bit about these different altitudes and then, okay.
Yeah, that's where I think we'll go next. So the way I want to think about these altitudes is there may be altitudes that you typically like to fly at. There may be altitudes that your staff like to fly at and that your organization as a whole likes to fly at. So as I walk through, you may just want to think about, where do I tend to fly? Where does my organization tend to fly? So a lot of organizations start from the place of your vision at that 60,000 foot level. They start from this place of what are we doing in the world? And they miss what is happening in the world around us. When you're working in a status quo, standard operating practice time, you can be pretty successful without thinking about the context that you're in. In a time of crisis where deeply held beliefs and deeply held systems may be shifting and transforming in real time. Oh, sorry, hold on one sec. We just got a boo-boo, hold on.
So I'll invite you, while Nico's taking care of that, I'll invite you to kind of look through the framework right now and let us know, maybe in our next poll, which altitude that you feel most comfortable with and that you naturally fly with. Okay, so we have the opportunity to look at kind of these higher altitudes, the seeing the forest, the vision, the 80,000 to 50,000 foot view. And then we have kind of this more mid-range, which I know Nico will get to next. And then sort of the drill down into sort of these lower altitudes of implementing. So we will be asking in our poll before we end, which is your natural altitude, and maybe identifying how do you understand what the natural altitudes of your board members, your leaders, and your staff are, so that when you're making shifts or pivots in your strategy, you can have kind of vision at all of those levels. So Nico, it sounds like
Thank
you, we're a good team here, I think.
Operator error. He just scratched himself and it was all over. So at the 80,000 foot level and seeing the forest, what we want to do is make sure we're thinking critically about what are the assumptions of our society, of our economy, of the sector that we're working on that might be shifting. And so we actually developed the paradigm shifts tool that you see there. And it is a tool to help your organization walk through how can we make meaning of what we're seeing and what's shifting around us. Then we come into how is our mission and vision shifting in relationship to these crises? And that's the 60,000 foot level, right? How is our mission and vision changing? And where is the relevance of our mission and vision in this moment? Are there changes that might need to be made? After we've grounded in those altitudes, the next altitude that comes in is needing to get more information. So this is what we're calling assessments. And is your organization optimized, and are you as a leader optimized to be getting the information you need to be making strong decisions together, right? A lot of times we can default into patterns of making decisions from our gut or from our past experience. And while those are still useful tools, with information and situations changing so rapidly around us, those aren't the only tools we can rely on for sources of information and decision making. And so how do we create stronger ways of getting that information? So you want to be getting information from a couple of different areas, right? And we list all of these different areas because organizations may tend to have a particular place that they are really good at getting information on. Like you may be very keyed into your members. You may be less keyed into the people your members need to operate with in the world. You may be very keyed into, if you're in the healthcare sector, making sure that you're paying attention to that. And shifts in the housing and education sector may be impacting your healthcare work, right? So we want to be looking at the primary crises that you're focused on, but also what are other crises that might be coming up? What are the different aspects of the community that you are hearing from? And are there certain parts of the community you need to be more proactive and in seeking out, right? Because one of the ways, a leader that I work with out of California had this really beautiful image of, in standard operating time, there are these well-worn pathways that we always walk, right? And in times of crisis, if we don't stop to think strategically, we're just going to walk those exact same well-worn pathways. Well, many of those pathways are inequitable, are unjust, have already silenced people. And so it's our job to kind of become aware of who do we hear, whose voices are already typically to the fore, and what do we need to shift in our relationship to really be getting the information and the stories that we need in order to make our decisions. And we pull out justice here, and this is on page 4. We pull out justice here on this altitude. For some, asking questions about justice and equity are kind of your bread and butter every day. And for others, there really needs to become an intentional practice of making this a daily practice. That it's not just a question that we ask at our quarterly check-ins or at our board retreat or at our staff gathering, and then we go back to a different set of questions, but that there are questions of justice or equity that are actually a part of that day-to-day process of the decision-making that you're making together.
I did want to share, sorry, Nico, I don't know that I had shared this with you, but I'll make sure I link it in the notes. We do have a really great For Equity tool that our social capital has put together with some key questions for decision points. And I like what you're saying here about looking at it as a more kind of thread through everything and every daily choice, but I will make sure to pop in our For Equity tool as well. As a community, we're really trying to lift that up and encourage the nonprofit sector to embrace it. So I'll make sure that that gets popped in the chat. Thanks.
Beautiful. So the next altitude is really about shifting how we think about time as we're moving through a crisis. And this is one of the key insights from that conversation with that board chair and that executive director many, many weeks ago, was that we actually need to be able to see 3 different time horizons simultaneously and be making decisions in relationship to those 3 times, right? So we have a rolling 6 weeks of, are we still in crisis? Okay, we need a 6-week time horizon. Are we still in crisis? Okay, we need a 6-week time horizon. So like, we're still, in my opinion, in that needing to have 6-week time horizon. I don't think we're like kind of dropped out of crisis yet. Like, okay, now we can plan for 6 months, because we really, the information is still changing so rapidly that you don't want to build too strong a plan that can't mold and shift to these changes that are happening in the short term. So we think about the short term, but we don't want to leave the medium and the long term unprepared, right? And so we want to make sure that there are some people on our team that are thinking about, okay, 6 months from now, what do we think today we might need? And that's going to keep evolving, right? And 2 years from now, where do we want to be? And so what decisions do we need to make now to at least try to hope to get there, right? And how do people thinking in these different time frames engage each other in questions rather than getting into a tug of war? So one of the things that I see often is, if you've got people who their safety response in a crisis is to think about the immediate and the short term, and you've got some people whose safety response in a crisis is to think about the long term, and then they get into a staff meeting, they say, oh, what should we do? They can get into a real fight if they haven't said, hey, I'm foregrounding the short term, I'm foregrounding the long term. Great, let's translate with each other. Let's do some negotiation. So we really need to have touch points at those higher altitudes to then be able to drop into the 20,000 foot strategy altitude, right? And strategy becomes much more iterative in a crisis. It's less, what is this thing that says what we're going to do in the next year? And it's much more, what are the principles, compass points, guiding values that will ensure we're on our strategic journey? So I call these strategic directions. And once we've dropped out of that 6-week crisis rapid response mode, then we can start to say, okay, what does this mean for the 6 months? What does this mean for the 2 years, right? And our last layer, which is the layer that's kind of the place that I know a lot of folks that are successful in the nonprofit sector really like to live in, which is implementing in the day-to-day, right? And in the implementing, these were just a couple of reminders that we wanted to help people not forget, right? There's probably 20 roles we could put in implementing. Some of the pitfalls we were seeing throughout the first months of COVID-19 was people just threw their work plans away instead of building an iterative work plan that could could mold and shift and could handle rapid response. So we wanted people to keep those work plans there, but maybe reformat them and shift them so that there's still a sense of purpose and people don't become rudderless, right? Really implementing altitude check-ins on a regular basis, because you can fly at any of these altitudes. It's not like this isn't like a linear, you have to do one to do the other, but you need all of the altitudes together to do good strategic thinking, right? And so you want to do altitude check-ins so that you're not missing or getting misaligned as you're moving through these processes. And then in the day-to-day, what were we seeing? This evolved and changed. This whole document probably got rewritten at least 12 different versions over time. The day-to-day and that zero level is really about how do we stay in our bodies? How do we manage our emotions? How do we optimize our critical thinking skills when we're stressed out? I don't know about you, but I got to a place probably 6 weeks into the racial justice uprisings that are happening around the country. And I just started to not be able to think clearly anymore. I started forgetting things. My husband was like, "You have a memory like a steel trap and you're forgetting?" Like, what's going on? And I was like, I think something's breaking down and it needs to be restored. And so I ended up taking a 2-week break to really just allow my body to do some healing from the stressors that it had been on to be able to step back into the work. So Brianne, I'm going to stop there, and I wanted to open it up to questions. And however you like to facilitate the question and answer piece. I know you're a pro at this.
Thanks. We have had such wonderful participation throughout community circles. And so I'm hopeful, maybe if we wanted, if folks could lift up their questions in the chat, and then I could voice them to Nico, and we could.
And I have that open too.
Okay. All right. And I'll voice them for the folks who are on the phone. And then if you wanted to, have a follow-up or, engage in a conversation, you'd be welcome to turn your video on and your audio for that. But I see a question here. How do you engage staff members in understanding the concept of altitudes to engage conversation? So can we start there?
I use a lot of pictures. So you can do this in a Google Doc. I'm somebody who lives with those big butcher Post-it notes and markers. So I just treat Google Docs as if it's my big butcher paper on the wall on a Zoom. And I literally will just, I'll draw each altitude, and you'll see Brianne and I have repurposed these as 3. So high altitude, medium altitude, and low altitude. And once I draw a picture, there's very few folks who aren't like, "Oh yeah, that makes sense," right? Like, hey, you like to think about the day-to-day, or you're somebody who likes to like kind of fly a little bit above, but you want to think about your projects. You're kind of in the middle, or you're thinking about 2023. You see the vision on high. And usually when I laugh a little bit and share those characterizations, people are able to get it. If there's a specific follow-up question on how to introduce it to staff, please let me know.
Sure. Well, I know Angie on our team has a love affair with Mr. Sketch markers and butcher paper. So, if you have any examples of visuals, since we are visual learners, some of us, and maybe that's just follow-up that I could send out later, that would be really fun to see. And I have also seen, a trend maybe with bringing in illustrators when you're having these strategic conversations. I've been part of a couple of different convenings that have employed artists to come in and really kind of capture the themes of conversations as almost an additional form of facilitation. And so, that's something to think about as well. So I think I saw you sketching, or do you have something that you wanted to share right away?
Okay. I'm going to send my visual.
Okay. I see another question about the strategies altitude. So you mentioned letting principles be one of the guides. What were the other things? So maybe we should go back to that strategies altitude and remind me, is that 40,000 foot?
That's 20,000.
20,000. Okay, here we go.
Yeah. So some of the things that can guide this, and this may be actually something that we actually add into the document. Every time we talk with people, I learn a new thing that I might like to add. When I think about strategic directions, here are the things. Like, I think about this in a very technical way of, as a human being, what do I use to make decisions? So typically, adult learners have four different things, four different places that they go to when they're making decisions. One is, what can I do? What's action oriented? One is, what do I believe? So that's like principles, right? Like, what are my beliefs? What are the rules? And this is different than beliefs, right? So like, what are the ethics, right? And then the other is, how am I feeling? Okay. So strategic directions can come in any one of these four forms. And what you want to think about is, which of these do I typically use? Where might there be gaps? Right? And so the ones that we come to the most are probably values and beliefs and morals and rules. But we don't want to miss that relational feeling as a guide, like, we're going to care for everyone in this moment. Yes, that's a value, but that also leads us to touch in with our feelings when we're making decisions and strategy conversations as a real meaningful input and source of information. And what we want to do is make sure we don't over bias action, because fear, anxiety, and stress can lead us to say, I need to get control. A desire for control can say, I need to act. And premature action without accurate assessments can lead to, at best, mistakes, at worst, harm.
Yeah, that tendency towards action was something that came up in the racial equity conversations that we've been having, and kind of how are we as leaders honoring all of those different I guess methods or foundations. I have a question with COVID. How do you do some of the rapid community listening sessions while keeping people safe?
So if the person that asked that question wants to follow up with a little bit more context about safety, I can think about like 10 different things that might make someone unsafe. And I'm probably not going to account for all of them in this answer. So I'll give a first answer, and if there's a follow-up, let me know. So one of the first ways that I think about rapid response community listening, and the invitation that was inherent in that line, is thinking about, how do we not do this in an overly structured way where harm often happens to communities? So a lot of times people have experienced like data gathering and surveys that actually make them feel silenced and invisible, or feel like they're being asked a question in a way that it's extractive, right? And so we use this framing of rapid response community listening to say, like, that could be like concentric circles of texting people, right? That could be asking people to say, who do you know that we should bring into this conversation? But really, instead of thinking about people in a way, I think a lot of nonprofits that are working in dominant norms, they're like, okay, there's like 400 people that live in this community. How do we talk to all of them? That will lead to processes that are extractive and work at a scale that's not relational. If we look at it and say, okay, here is a network of our map of relationships. What are the ways we communicate? What are the ways we don't communicate? How can we use what exists and build what's missing to allow information to flow in a way that feels powerful to everyone? So I use the examples of text message, email. It's been harder to do drop-bys, but now sometimes people are wearing masks and kind of doing distance. But really treating rapid response listening as listening, not information gathering. When you're listening, you're hearing story, you're hearing narrative, and you're actually listening for all four: action, beliefs, ethics, and feelings.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you. I would invite Aubrey, who is always, I think, happy to turn on her video and audio because she does have a follow-up, and she's been a presenter with us before. Aubrey is the executive director of Eat Greater Des Moines, which works in the food space. And Aubrey, actually, I put you on the spot with a video. I don't feel like you need to turn your video on, but if you're not having one of those days. But if you'd like to just kind of voice your follow-up to Nico, if you have the capacity to do that. Otherwise, just let me know and I can read your further messages. But she's asking about food rescue. So go ahead, Aubrey.
Well, so I appreciate you kind of answering this. So we do a lot of, we work in the food space, and we tend to work within and outside of the traditional emergency food system responses. So we've been putting excess recovered food and items and produce in what I consider non-traditional locations, so affordable housing communities, different churches and community partners. And I think that all started really quickly, and we haven't had a chance to necessarily have some of those feedback or conversations about, like, how is this working? Is there something else we could look at getting, or different types of food? I think we would love to be able to have some of those, just kind of follow-up kind of conversations to make sure that we are considering the different, needs and responses that we could be trying to uncover if we knew about them.
Yeah. Let me get even more practical, Aubrey, because this is so funny. I was actually having this conversation with an organization like literally 48 hours ago. That's in a very similar situation. So they do healthcare for farm workers in Maine. Yeah. And very similar, like, hey, we just got to get this out the door. We got to get the healthcare out the door. We got to get the tests out the door. And then they were in a meeting with me and they said, okay, like, what do we do? And I think, and I'm not sure that this is what you're saying, Aubrey, but in their minds in that conversation, it was like, they want to do listening really well. They want to do it comprehensively. They want to not miss anybody. And I was kind of like, I love those intentions, but I'm going to step back from that outcome. And I'm going to say, what are the strategic directions? Okay, we want to be relational. We want to be inclusive. We want to be like really deep listening and active listening. And I'm like, okay, what's a way that we can do that where the outcome's going to look a little different? It's not going to look like this beautiful listening project. And some of the things that we came up with in that conversation was like, the first thing I did was, for all of the staff that were going to do that direct communication, I was like, what are you noticing? And I wanted to start to bring them into more mindful noticing. Like, did they pass people that were smiling at them while they dropped off the food? Like, did they see a bunch of toys on the ground that hadn't been picked up? Did they see no toys? Like, do you know what I mean? Like, so I started to think about, like, what are questions we can ask ourselves that you might actually have a lot of observations and informations that you've collected that you didn't even realize? Or in the next 2 weeks, can you start a period of mindfulness? That what information could you get without even needing to take a directly impacted person's time? Mm-hmm. And then so then the next layer up is, could you role play what it's like to get informal information in non-extractive ways, right? And so some of that is role playing with people, like, what is a polite way to say, hey, how you doing? Like, hey, I'm with this food box. What do you think about it? You know what I mean? And just kind of build out some more informal scripts of how you're getting that information. If you did those 3 things, what have you noticed? Intentional mindfulness for 2 weeks and some informal communications gathering. Then I would stop and say, okay, now what do we think we don't know?
Yeah, that's helpful.
Cool.
Thank you so much, Aubrey. I love hearing, I think what we've heard throughout community circles is that we need this mix of, like, kind of high level thinking and then this really tactical solutions and problem solving as a community. And so thank you for those great thoughts. Trey Wade is the executive director of Every Step, which is Trey, I'll let you explain all the amazing things that you do in our community. But they have really been strategically aligning. They're maybe best known for some of their hospice work. And then they also help children and families, really people along the life cycle. So Trey, if you wanted to either just audio or video your chat to Nico, it sounds like you have some questions.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you could elaborate a little bit on how you pivot toward a longer term view, knowing there is just so much uncertainty, and how you can make decisions today looking at the current environment that are irrelevant tomorrow. And so that's where I think we've been struggling a little bit, is you start to go down a path and then realize, well, that doesn't seem terribly relevant in this environment.
So Trey, I'm going to offer like 3 different thoughts about this. And then if you have a follow-up question, let me know. So one of the ways I think about this, and I started to kind of leave breadcrumbs about this before, is actually, can you devote different staff or members to kind of like little work groups to the different timeframes? And within each of those timeframes, some of what we've got in this framework are some of the questions that those work groups could be gathering information on, right? So before we try to vision what is that to your strategy, could we actually build systems that are iterating, gathering more information in each of those 3 timeframes? And then with that information, could each of those groups, and so I could imagine like a little working group on the next 6 weeks, a little working group on the 6 months, and then on 2 years, saying, okay, if this was our original mission, if this was our initial outcomes, which of these outcomes are completely off the table? Which of these outcomes could be still on the table? Are there some new outcomes that might still be good, but different? And then what are some different scenarios we could see that would lead us to these outcomes? And this is especially relevant to these long-term planners, right? So for example, if you're an organization that's working on dental healthcare legislation in Maine, right? Our healthcare system is shifting very radically now, right? And your end goal is to have free dental healthcare access for everyone in the state of Maine. There's a way you could just say, do I need to throw that out the window? And we're like, no, don't throw it out the window. But what you could start to do is say, okay, let's still keep that as one like outcome. Maybe, and maybe the path to that outcome we thought was going to be introducing legislation in 2020 and passing it in the legislative session this fall. That's not going to happen this year. What are other scenarios and how would we get to that, right? Could it be action by the governor? Could it be getting a recommendation from our dental health industry as they're going through a paradigm shift in COVID-19? So we start to like expand our imagination of what was economically possible, socially possible, politically possible. And then we create scenarios for those different paths, right? And then we start to gather information of which scenario does it look like we're getting closer or farther from, right? And using the paradigm shift tool that's in the 80,000 foot level to envision those different scenarios, like that's like a worksheet. It's like a 13-page worksheet, but essentially you could hand that to a long-term scenario planning group and they could actually physically try to think through their different scenarios. So what we want to do is step back from this thing of like, we're going to name this outcome, we're going to name this outcome, we're going to name this outcome, and we're going to get to it. And what we want to step into is we're going to have multiple outcomes that could be possible, and we're going to have an iterative process of figuring out where we're going. And sorry, I actually think the link might not be in the version you have. I'm not actually sure where you got the version that you have. I'm going to pop the link in there right now. Trey, do you have a follow-up question on that?
Thank you. This one is, I think, the one I got from your website, but I've been visiting it quite regularly, and so I'm not sure which version I'm on. If you want to send me the most recent version, that would be great, and I'll make sure that goes out in our follow-up.
Yeah, it's in the chat now. Trey, did you have a follow-up on that before we go to other questions?
Not so much a follow. I see that working very well for strategic directions you were going to go in prior to the environment change. But we've also had some instances where we put a lot of time, effort, and energy into projects pivoting and leaning in toward the current crisis that don't come to fruition. Like, to give you an example, building on the information we were getting that hospitals and communities would be overwhelmed. We put a lot of time, effort, and energy into building a hospice unit specific, not building, physically building. We had the space, but getting prepared to provide inpatient hospice services to COVID positive patients. And it just was an effort that we can all be very proud of. But at the end of the day, it never, as of yet, materialized as a need. And working in partnership with our health systems, they eventually just said, we don't see our beds being overwhelmed. So I guess that was just one lesson in that we tried to pivot and look long-term on what the current environment was showing us, and put a lot of our resources, our immediate short-term resources, into that, only to find, well, that probably wasn't incredibly necessary.
Yeah. So Trey, I mean, I hold two things with compassion in that story, and I'm so glad you were able to share that. Thank you. I appreciate that. One is, one lesson I hear in that is the experiments during crisis have to be smaller. So one way that we pivot is to do smaller iterations that it take fewer resources. So rather than pivot thinking as we're pivoting this, it's actually this motion. And so it's asking, what are the smaller tests that use fewer resources that let us know if that scenario is the scenario we want to go down, right? So this is where you need to have that long-term scenario team talking to your rapid response team kind of like every week, because you're saying, okay, if we think we're going to need long-term hospice care, what is a test we could run in the next week or two that would test out if that's the direction we're going in? And Trey, the other thing I want to just hold with compassion is there may not have been a test. This may have been the only option. It was a good option, and there was no way to avoid it happening. And so then my brain goes to, is there anything from that that could be repurposed for other tests?
Thank you. I appreciate it, Nico.
Thanks, Trey. It's a great example.
Thank you so much. So I have a question kind of on the opposite end of the spectrum. I know that Trey and Every Step is one of our larger nonprofit organizations. Do you have advice for those emerging nonprofits who are working to form their structures and find their greatest points of impact? It feels like, that this is an opportunity to be doing that strategic planning for the first time in a long-term crisis is a unique scenario, maybe, is the question. And is this a framework that works kind of when you're not in crisis or when you're envisioning for the first time?
So, yes. I think this may be coming from Kevin. I'm not sure, because I also see it in the big group chat. But what I would say is, I think this is just the altitudes of strategic thinking. And the questions in here are designed for questions when we're going through paradigm shifts. Because another way to think about crisis is the human experiences change. We call certain things crises, and we know many of our communities were in crisis before COVID-19, are living crisis all the time. So in some ways, this framing of strategic thinking in crisis and what crisis is like, it's an artificial piece to like help people step into the conversation. So these altitudes, the questions that are in here, I mean, I might say, like, get your forming nonprofit group together and actually answer these questions for yourself. Take the paradigm shift worksheet, fill it out together, right? Take the assessments document, take 2 weeks, or the assessments piece, take 2 weeks to do those assessments, and then use VAST or POP to write your strategies. I mean, I think that there's a very close fit. And here's what I would say. I would actually love if more established organizations treated themselves like new and developing organizations. I think those fresh eyes on the work, and I think the mindfulness and presence you have to have when you're starting a project is exactly what's called for in this moment. So I don't actually see new or developing nonprofits as like behind the game and needing to catch up. I actually think that's like a sweet spot to be in, right?
Right.
And I want to take to Sally's question about where does the board fit into all of this? And then I know we need to move to close. It really depends on the structure of your board. So if you have a working board that actually is serving sometimes in ad hoc staff positions, I would at least do some level setting at all of the altitudes with them, because they're not going to be able to engage with you if they don't have the information, right? So you don't want them siloed. If you have a board that really is a fundraising board, I think you're fine with more of an executive director, high level leadership staff filling them in on these shifts and then coaching them through how their board work is going to change based on these shifts, right? So I don't think they need to bite the whole apple in knowing all the intricacies of the altitudes, but probably, especially in a fundraising board, each month you're going to want to have an altitude check-in, right? You're going to want them to know enough of what you're thinking. Yeah, so Aubrey, I'm with you.
Lena
in
in the chat had said basically Lena is on Aubrey's link. So this is why I feel like we need to challenge the narrative of naming racial inequity as a crisis or emergency. Crisis and emergency are acute. Racial injustice and health inequalities are generational and systemic.
Exactly.
So I think there's another good question in here that's a challenging question, but maybe a good one for us to end on is, we're right now in this acute COVID response situation. How much is the actual crisis what we should be planning for or around? I think I'm trying to interpret Amy's question. And how much is acknowledging the crisis as part of this framework what we want to do? And maybe we have the next generation's thoughts on the answer to that question. So
we have apples. So yeah, so I mean, so this is maybe this, and Brianne, you and I should think about this could be the real heart of that third session. So we're going to do 2 sessions from here. One session is going to be on,
we can have one
thank
more.
you, buddy. One session is going to be on where you personally fly. And then we were thinking about the third session being where your organization flies. So, with the farm workers that I work with, the conversation we have about COVID-19 is like, this isn't new. The injustices of our economy, of our food system, of racism, like we've been living this, like for people that think this is new, like welcome into this conversation. But that framing is so critical. And I really appreciate what Lena put through Aubrey's comment. And so, when we're planning for the long term, this is where I would love if folks could really look at that paradigm shift document, because essentially what we're saying in the paradigm shift document is we need to be able to think critically about power. We need to understand deeply how our economy works. And I think I interact with a lot of nonprofits that because we have a status quo that is committed to racism and class exploitation and many other injustices that I'm not able to name because of our time here, but speaking to all of these injustices together, we get away with not having to think about how our economy actually works, how our society actually works. And so the vision of white supremacy is what we just think a good economy is. The vision of class exploitation is what we just think a good society is. And this is a moment for us to step back and listen to the voices that have been saying for generations, this is not a good economy. This is not what a healthy society looks like. And we're building this long-term movement and this long-term systems change. And COVID-19 is a moment in that.
Thank you so much, Nico, for those thoughts and walking us through this. and I see in the chat, thank you, Joy, the One Economy Action Plan. Des Moines has been doing some work in this space, and we referenced it in the last community conversation, but really taking a look as you're looking at paradigm shifts at the One Economy Action Plan, the blueprint that recently came out for Black Polk County and Central Iowa will be very important and informative. So I just want to thank Nico on behalf of our Community Circles coordinating team and our community. As she mentioned, next week, she's going to record a little tee up for us because we are going to spend the majority of the time in breakout conversations with each other. So reflect, and if you want in the chat box before you go to just note for me, are you a high altitude person? Do you feel like you fly in the mid zone? Or are you more of a lower altitude tactical kind of a person? So if you feel comfortable enough to chat that, that would be informative because I'm not going to launch a new poll right now. And then, next week we'll come together. We'll have some circles around those different altitudes. And in the third week, Nico will be back with us in person to talk a little bit more about translating this organizationally as well for the long term. So thanks again, and thanks to all of you for participating today.